Hello, everyone. Hopefully, I didn't have any connectivity issues during that, but you saw that video. Anyway, so hello, everyone. I am Nibby from Pro Writing Aid, and you are oh gosh, we don't want the video again. And you are joining us today for the essentials of science fiction as part of our Science Fiction Writers Week. So today we're joined by Anne Hawley and Rochelle Ramirez of Pages and Platforms for the essentials of writing science fiction. Rochelle Ramirez is a developmental editor who helps writers structure and finish their projects. She's eager to assist writers with complex story structures and character arcs, and especially stories that are intended as catalysts for social justice. Anne Hawley is also a certified developmental editor who helps new and experienced authors turn story ideas into drafts and drafts into finished novels that will delight their readers. Anne and Rochelle are co-creators of the Story Path writing course and are instructors on numerous other writing masterclasses, so you're in very safe hands today. If you've been to one of their sessions before, you will already know that you're going to come away from this session with a ton of useful and actionable information that will help you start improving your novel right away. So with all of that said, let's begin. Hi, Anne and Rochelle.
Hello.
Did that all broadcast live and clear?
Yeah, love the music. I'm ready to go to the movies now.
I know you're ready. You're ready to go.
Yeah, that's
great. I will hand over to you guys and let you get started.
Great. Thank you. Give me just a sec to get started here. We'll share screen. I'm going to stop my video. Let's stop our videos, shall we? And share screen. Here we go. And turn this off. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Essentials of Writing Science Fiction from Pages and Platforms and the Happily Ever Author Club. That's us. Before we start, you can grab your free copy of the Pages and Platforms Guide to the 7 Essential Story Types. That title is going to mean a lot more to you by the end of this. And just go to pagesandplatforms.com/sci-fi for our special science fiction audience landing page to grab your copy of that. All right, so what brings you here today? Are you possibly stuck in the process of finishing your science fiction story? Or maybe you've completed a draft, but you can't quite figure out how to fix problems with it, or even how to define the problems that you sense. Maybe you have gotten lost down the research rabbit hole or tried plotting according to one of the many methods out there. Or maybe you're more of a pantser, or you're otherwise somehow feeling stuck somewhere along the path to your finished manuscript. Well, we know the feeling. I'm Anne Hawley, and here with me is my fellow developmental editor, Rochelle Ramirez. As Libby just said, we developed the concepts in this webinar to get you unstuck. Before we get going, a caveat. We cannot emphasize enough that everything we're going to show you in this presentation is a set of tools, not rules. There are some principles of what makes a good working story, and our clients have found them useful. We find them useful in our own writing practice, but please don't let any of our ideas shut down your creativity as a writer. Take what you need, leave the rest. The important thing is first to write the story that is in your heart to tell. Today, we're going to show you some ways to build, evaluate, and improve your science fiction story using 4 tools: marketing, category, and setting, also known as genre, essential story elements, story types, and world building. By the end of this webinar, you'll have a much clearer idea of how to evoke empathy for your characters, create tension and excitement, provide emotional satisfaction for your reader, and convey a thoughtful takeaway in your story. And you will be able to meet readers' overall expectations for your story type so that they will be happy to recommend your book and they will be eager to read the next thing you write. To approach those lofty goals, we need to start with a fundamental idea. Science fiction isn't a story type. Science fiction is a story environment. It's a setting, and it's a marketing category. Put another way, it is a genre. And the difference between genre, that is marketing category and setting, and story type is the key piece of information we hope you're going to take away today. As your story's setting or environment, just to define our terms, the term science fiction generally refers to stories where your reader can expect to suspend a significant degree of disbelief A story may have a cautionary premise, referring as much to current times as to an imagined future or alternate world. They are likely to involve predicted or speculative technology. They may take place on other planets, in this world or alternate worlds, or in space. And they are generally regarded as speculative and imaginative and may veer from accepted scientific facts that are known today. At writers' conventions and book fairs, we always ask people what they're writing. And most writers who are writing in science fiction genre will say so. I'm writing science fiction. And then they might add something like YA, LGBTQ, dystopian, hard sci-fi, space opera, etc. Now, these categories tend to describe the specific kind of world the story takes place in, or the age or orientation or social demographic of the intended reader. And these subcategories might make or break a potential reader's decision whether to read your book or not. So it's important because many readers are specifically looking for hard science fiction or dystopian stories, for instance, and you as the author need to be clear on what it is you're offering. Each of these subcategories has its own trends, conventions, and rules. They change and shift all the time. It's a all ever morphing field, and you do need to understand them. But your science fiction genre and its subgenres alone cannot tell you most of what you need to know as a writer to build and finish your story. That is what story type is for, and Rochelle will be covering that in a couple minutes. No matter which science fiction category or subgenre you're writing in, your story structure has to work the same way as if it were set in modern-day Los Angeles. This means that a science fiction story will need to meet certain criteria that most good working stories of any genre have in common. And that brings us to our second major topic, the essential story elements that need to be in place before you really have a professional working draft. We've got one more caveat for you. Writing a novel or other book-length work of fiction is not a one draft process. Sorry about that. That movie image where the writer's typing page after page, stacking them up and finally typing the end, and then sending the whole stack off to their publisher is a total myth. I'm sure most people here know that, but it's always worth mentioning. First, you need a zero draft. This is where you metaphorically back the truck up to the construction site and unload all the building materials. This is the everything draft, the vomit draft, the messy draft, however you want to think about it. This is where you pour all your ideas, your character sketches and backstories, all that sort of thing. And it doesn't matter whether you outline or just start writing like a true pantser, your initial draft, whatever it is, will need work before it becomes a professional working draft. So let's define that professional draft. To count as a professional draft, your story should have a protagonist with a singular, clear desire. That desire establishes something the protagonist wants to gain and something they fear to lose. In other words, it creates stakes. Pursuing their desire and facing those stakes causes the protagonist to change. The story will have a clear premise that is reflected subtly or overtly in every scene, and it will be driving toward the emotion for your story type expects to feel. So, desire, stakes, change, premise, and emotion. When these 5 elements are clear and your story is working, then revisions can begin. And then you're on your way to that fully finished and polished story where you type the end. And when you nail these elements, you will be able to attract the reader who is just waiting to choose your story. Now, I'm going to pass this discussion to Rochelle. She is literally one of the world's foremost experts on story types. She helped create numerous masterclasses on the subject for our Happily Ever Author Club, and she is here today to share a whole bunch of what she has learned. Rochelle?
Thanks, Anne. I'm excited to cover this section because choosing your story type is the single most critical decision you'll make in writing your science fiction story. Story types give you the practical and applicable assistance you need for creating a working draft. That's because your story type determines those important story elements Anne just went over. Your story type defines your protagonist's motivation, also known as the desire or the want and need. It defines what kind of things are at stake, what your protagonist has to gain and lose. Story type tells you the specific kind of change arc your protagonist undergoes from beginning to the end of the story. And it specifies the kinds of emotions you should aim to evoke in your reader. Story type contains a basic premise or message, which is the idea you want the reader to take away from your story. You'll meet all these elements again in just a minute. All of these essential elements shape your story and inform the story events. That's because story types are a way to understand and communicate the kind of story you're telling. And as Anne mentioned a few minutes ago, story type isn't analogous to marketing categories or genres that are used by publishers to communicate with potential buyers. Story types are not explicit in back cover blurbs. Agents and readers don't use these in their decision of whether or not to read your book. Story types are for writers and editors who use them for crafting cohesive stories. And as we see it at Pages and Platforms, there are 7 essential story types. Now, other writers and editors have identified more, but we've distilled it down to the 7 for the sake of simplicity and ease of use. There are 7 distinctive plot forms, each with individual character motivations, stakes, reader emotions, premises, and more. You and your editor can use story types to identify and fix deep structural issues in your manuscript. And knowing your story type will help you both understand and discuss the kind of story you're telling. Story types are the key to organizing, including, and evaluating those essential story elements we just went over. So what are the 7 story types? Here's a quick overview, and then we're going to look at each one of these individually. The 7 story types are action, crime, horror, love, worldview, validation, and redemption. And let's look at them one by one and watch for those essential elements as we go along. The first story type is action. Action stories are as old as humankind. They teach us the importance of individual heroism in the face of danger. Identifying an action story is pretty easy for most of us because action stories are plot-driven and involve escape, chase, adventure, rescue, or rebellion. The action protagonist is motivated by a desire to save lives or avoid danger. So action stories involve the high stakes of life and death, or at least safety and danger. The action protagonist usually begins in ordinary life, moves through high stakes danger, and ends as a hero to other people after having restored safety. Now, if you're writing an action story, the reader you're writing for likely wants to feel excitement. They want to imagine their own bravery in the face of danger. It's your job to deliver those feelings. So before we look at action's essential premise, we should first define what a premise is. A premise, sometimes called a controlling idea or a theme, is a single sentence statement that describes the value change of the entire story at the climax and identifies the cause of that change. It names the primary story event, what happens, and why. And keep in mind that these premise statements you'll hear for each story type is broad and general, and that you'll need to personalize it to your story. For action, the general essential premise is that heroic action leads to saving lives, whereas villainous behavior leads to loss of life. This could end negatively as well when the protagonist fails, dies, or is damned if they fail to act to save the victim. We see the primary story event, villainous behavior. We see the big story change at the climax, saving lives or possibly loss of lives. And we see the cause of the change, heroic action. Action stories in science fiction realms are not hard to find. Most popular science fiction films, including superhero and comic book movies, are primarily centered on a hero motivated to save lives. In novels, the subject matter can run a little deeper and turn more philosophical, but there's plenty of action to choose from. Andy Weir's mega hit, The Martian, is set in a realistic near future and leverages current science to pit a stranded astronaut against the antagonistic Mars landscape. He takes heroic and desperate measures to stay alive. That is, to save himself as both hero and victim until rescue can come. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler begins with the seed of an idea for a new religion, but quickly turns into an action story of chase and adventure as the protagonist leads a group of followers away from roving bands of violent addicts through fire and an earthquake to a promised land. While this novel of ideas has a strong character-driven coming-of-age plot for its young protagonist, her leadership role in facing danger makes action its main plot. Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban is set roughly 2,000 years after a nuclear war devastated civilization. Ridley, the young narrator, has a chosen one arc of adventure across the harsh and toxic landscape, facing deadly packs of wild dogs, rough tribal communities, and nefarious government agents, as he slowly uncovers efforts to recreate the weapon that destroyed the ancient world in the first place. The second story type is crime. We enjoy reading, watching, and writing crime stories because they show us that social order and justice depend on clever people who can outsmart chaotic wrongdoers by using brains rather than brawn. Crime stories, like action stories, are plot-driven. They involve solving a puzzle, investigating a crime, or planning a heist. The crime protagonist is motivated by a desire to solve a puzzle, restore social order, or bring a wrongdoer to justice. And that means what's at stake in a crime story is justice and order. If the protagonist doesn't win, injustice and chaos will prevail. The crime protagonist generally starts out facing chaos, disorder, a crime, or a big question. They end in a more ordered state with a solution to the puzzle, justice, and restored order. Crime story readers want to feel the intrigue of solving a puzzle along with, or just before, the protagonist. And they tend to enjoy the sense of security in seeing justice prevail. Crime's essential premise, its primary underlying idea, is that criminal activity results in chaos, whereas the pursuit of justice restores social order. Again, we see the primary story event, criminal activity. We see the big story change at the climax, restored social order, and we see the cause of the change, the pursuit of justice. Some crime stories set in science fiction worlds include 6 Wakes by Mur Lafferty, modeled on the classic closed room murder mystery. This novel takes place on a generation ship in deep space, where crew members are cloned as they age and die. The protagonist awakens from deep cryogenic sleep 25 years into the voyage to discover her last clone and the clones of the rest of the crew have been murdered. The culprit could be any one of them, including the protagonist herself. Lock-In by John Scalzi is a police procedural set in a near-future world where an epidemic has left 1% of its victims locked in or trapped, fully conscious in unmoving and unsensing bodies. Some can afford robot-like vehicles they can transfer their consciousness into, and one such person is the protagonist, a federal agent assigned to solve a murder involving the misuse of the same technology. and Dark Run by Mike Brooks, set in a corrupt galaxy where life is cheap and criminals are the best people in it. The epic space heist has a crew of thieves and con artists who take on dangerous secret jobs that could pay off a lot of debts if they survive. The third story type is horror. Horror stories exist to remind us that evil is never really destroyed, but the courage and internal vigilance of ordinary people can keep it at bay. Horror stories are plot-driven, with a monster intent on destruction and a protagonist who becomes a victim. The monster can be anything: a human, a sociopath, an animal, an alien, a supernatural being, any being or force that does evil as part of its basic nature and can't be reasoned with. The protagonist is motivated by staying alive and avoiding a fate worse than death, such as torture. That means that the stakes in a horror story involve life, death, escape, and torment. The horror protagonist generally changes along a continuum from safety to danger to the threat of torment to escape. The horror reader wants to feel terror and imagine their bravery in facing a monster. Horror's essential premise is that ordinary people can keep evil at bay with courage and vigilance, whereas cowardice and indifference allow the monster to win and for evil to thrive. We see a primary story event, evil. We see the big story change at the climax, evil is kept at bay. And we see the cause of the change, the courage and vigilance of ordinary people. Horror almost always has an inherent speculative element, and its monsters can be aliens or technology, including biological entities like diseases. Jordan Peele's film, Get Out, puts a young Black man into the country home of his white girlfriend's parents, where a secret technology is doing horrible things to other Black people, and it's coming for him next. Note that there's a secondary monster of racism operating in this story as well. Salvation Day by Callie Wallace gives us an abandoned exploration ship whose entire crew has been killed by a virus. Now, a motley band of space wanderers wants to take the ship and make it their own. They don't know that sleeping alongside the orbiting dead is a deadly secret that threatens all of humanity until they wake it up. And the classic science fiction film Alien, a near perfect model of a horror story where an alien monster picks off its victims one by one in a mining vessel far out in space. Love, now for a change of pace. The love story. Here's a chance for us to debunk a misconception, because it turns out that the love story isn't limited to the romance novel or rom-com. Love stories overall show us how to earn the intimacy, love, and togetherness that are essential to human thriving. Love stories are both plot-driven and character-driven and involve relationships of intimacy, vulnerability, and commitment, including friendship and family love, as well as romantic love. The love protagonist is motivated by a desire to win love or avoid vulnerability. The love protagonist risks rejection and vulnerability in order to gain intimacy and togetherness. The love protagonist usually changes along a continuum from disconnection and loneliness to connection and togetherness, but a less happy love story can go either way. The love reader wants to feel anticipation of intimacy and vulnerability without the risk. Romantic and sexual anticipation may be at play in stories involving romantic love. The essential premise of the love story is that a willingness to be vulnerable leads to love, whereas an unwillingness to be vulnerable results in the loss of love and probable loneliness. The primary story event, desire for connection. We see the big story change at the climax, gaining love or losing love, and the cause of that change, risking vulnerability or failing to. Love and science fiction make an unusual pairing. So let's look at some examples. The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger is a love story about a man with a genetic disorder that causes him to time travel unpredictably, while Claire, an artist and his loving wife, has known him across time and must cope with his frequent disappearances into the time stream. Charlie Kaufman's film, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, posits the existence of a technology that erases the memories of failed relationships and helps the bereaved and the rejected overcome their trauma and loss. It tells the story of two lovers who get back together again, even after this erasure. In Sean David Hutchinson's A Complicated Love Story set in space, three young people find themselves aboard a ship with no idea how they got there. They face aliens and disruptive memory technologies, while two of them are falling in love. The novel has a telling tagline: "Love is complicated enough without also trying to stay alive," letting us know that it's as much an action story as a love story. The fifth story type is worldview. The cultural purpose of the worldview story, broadly speaking, is to show that the world is not a simple black and white place. They teach us about accepting the nuance and complexity of other people and ourselves. Often referred to as a maturation or coming of age story, the worldview story is character-driven and involves a protagonist confronting their naivete, experiencing disillusionment, or finding meaning. The worldview protagonist's primary motivation is a desire either to gain knowledge or avoid some unpleasant truth, whether they're conscious of this desire or not. This means that the stakes for the worldview protagonist, what they have to gain or what they have to lose, are their ignorance or their cherished beliefs, while what they have to gain are knowledge and wisdom. The worldview protagonist's arc of change is from ignorance to knowledge or wisdom. They tend to move from seeing the world in shades of black and white to understanding the role in a world of grays. They grow up. The reader chooses or enjoys a worldview story because they want to feel empathetic satisfaction or pity. They may also enjoy feeling comparatively wise and mature. The essential premise of the worldview story is that open-mindedness in the face of new information leads to wisdom, whereas avoiding the truth results in self-deception. So we see a primary story event, that's new information. We see the big story change at the climax, wisdom or alternatively self-deception, and we see the cause of the change, open-mindedness or else avoiding the truth. You will find a worldview arc in almost any story involving a young adult protagonist, but the story type goes beyond just coming of age or maturation. The worldview protagonist can be of any age. Here are some examples. The Nobodies by Alana Shubot tells of two best friends who discover that by putting their foreheads together, they can swap bodies. And as their worlds begin to mesh, each deceives the other, confesses, and is forgiven. But they each have to contend with the disappearing boundaries between them and the question of their own identities. As a story of strong female friendship, we might see The Nobodies as having a secondary love story of the intimate friendship variety. Ray Bradbury's classic and haunting short story, All Summer in a Day, is set in a colony on Venus where it never stops raining except 1 hour every 7 years. The child protagonist is from Earth, and unlike her new classmates, she has seen the sun before, talks a lot about it, and is longing to see it again. As the special hour approaches, jealous classroom bullies lock her in a closet and forget about her. And when they let her out, The sun has come and gone, and she's left in loss and grief to consider human nature. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a 1973 short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, set in a utopian city called Omelas, whose prosperity depends on the perpetual misery of a single child. When citizens learn this fact, most eventually acquiesce, but a few walk away. Nobody in Omelas, including the narrator, knows where they go, but they never come back. Typical of many short stories, science fiction or otherwise, this one and the previous example create a worldview shift in the reader as much as in the protagonist. Now for validation. This is the sixth story type and one that confuses a lot of writers. We read, watch, and write validation stories to examine our personal and cultural definitions of success and failure, and to remind ourselves that honorable values are more important than worldly success. Validation stories are character-driven and involve the protagonist's search for success and esteem. The validation protagonist is motivated by a desire for success, honor, and validation by others. For example, winning the trophy, triumphing in a competition, or moving higher in a social ranking or wealth. Validation stakes, what the protagonist has to gain and what they have to lose, involve success, failure, and selling out of true values. So the validation protagonist changes most along the spectrum of success, compromise, failure, and selling out or dishonor. They may start out successful and fall, or start low and rise. The validation reader wants to feel admiration or pity and enjoy a sense of moral superiority. The essential premise of a validation story is that ethical choices create honorable success, whereas unworthy goals lead to selling out one's true values. The primary story event here is at least implied, some opportunity to rise. We see the big story change at the climax, that's honorable success or selling out, and we see the cause of that change, ethical choices or unethical ones. A validation story in a science fiction milieu isn't the most common combination, which might point to a good area for innovation. Here are some examples we were able to find. Terry Pratchett's novels are not absolutely classifiable as either science fiction or fantasy, but they do fall in the broad realm of speculative fiction, and they're a delight. In Going Postal, a convicted con artist is given a choice to run the moribund postal service in the capital city of Discworld instead of being hanged. It's a hopeless task, but he becomes committed to succeeding by bringing the institution back to life. His adventures in uncovering a criminal conspiracy at the same time give this validation story a strong secondary crime story type. John Pepper's Green Goddess gives us the high-powered CEO of a fossil fuel energy company in the near future, who must at least fake believing in the environmental movement in order to keep the corporation going. She eventually finds a way to fund research into fusion energy as an innovative answer to climate change. Matt Haig's The Midnight Library is also arguably more fantasy than science fiction, depending on whether you think the mechanism for the plot is weird science or outright magic. A young woman dissatisfied with her choices in life attempts suicide and finds herself between life and death in a library that contains the stories of all the alternate lives she might have lived. She visits them one by one, from an unhappy marriage to wild success as a rock star. She ultimately re-enters life with a new definition of what comprises a good life. Our seventh and final story type is redemption. Now, redemption stories are harder to find these days than they were in the past, but we have tended to tell them as a reminder that our wrongs can be forgiven if we take altruistic actions and sacrifice for the greater good. Redemption stories are character-driven and involve forgiveness and atonement. The redemption protagonist is motivated from the outset by guilt, shame, and a desire for forgiveness. The redemption protagonist risks not being forgiven and has to make sacrifices, but stands to gain atonement, forgiveness, and reconnection. They must make an active choice between selfishness and altruism. If they choose selfishness, they lose, and if they choose altruism, they win, but must sacrifice something important to them. The redemption protagonist almost always begins as a despicable character, knowingly doing or having done wrong, and changes for the better through altruistic sacrifice and difficult lessons. Alternately, they may begin hoping for redemption, but end having failed to attain it through incurable character weakness. The redemption reader wants to feel satisfaction, pity, or contempt, or moral superiority if the character makes poor choices and fails. The essential premise of a redemption story type is altruistic action results in redemption, whereas selfishness leads to moral failure. In other words, redemption results when the protagonist atones for past wrongdoing by abandoning selfish goals and sacrificing for the greater good. Usually, the primary story event is the opportunity to make amends. The big story change at the climax is redemption or else moral failure, and the cause of the change is altruistic action and sacrifice, or selfish action. True redemption stories in a true science fiction setting was a little hard to find, and we really only came up with one novel, an old one. This could be a real opportunity for innovation. Gateway by Frederick Pohl begins in high action with a hero who is willing to sacrifice his life in a suicide mission to a black hole in order to let a large group of people live. But in the unstable event, his ship survives and the others don't. His survivor's guilt drives the rest of the story as he seeks atonement, which is never truly possible for him. Of course, characters all over superhero and science fiction stories have individual redemption arcs, even though the stories are primarily action. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Natasha Romanoff is driven in part by her need to atone for wrongs she's done as a spy, saying, "There's red in my ledger." George Lucas has said that the 6 original Star Wars films were about the rise, fall, and redemption of Anakin Skywalker. Most of us would have a hard time overlooking his heinous atrocities, but as the story is presented, he shows regret and experiences release at death when his son Luke recognizes him. And there you have them, the 7 story types. There's so much to learn about combining story types, and at Pages and Platforms, we've developed a whole 20-module course on the subject. But the short version is that you need to weave a plot-driven story type with a character-driven story type to deliver a story that will truly engage your reader. Either choose a plot-driven primary story supported by a character-driven secondary arc, or choose a character-driven primary story where a plot-driven story type presents the external challenges your protagonist needs in order to change. Why? Because even the most heroic action protagonist undergoes some internal change, and even the quietest of an introverted protagonist has to face troubles from the outside world. As a reminder, the plot-driven story types are action, crime, horror, and love, while the character-driven story types are worldview, validation, and redemption. You may have noticed that in several of our examples, I mentioned a secondary or supporting story type. For instance, love with action, a complicated love story set in space. Action with redemption, Gateway. Validation with crime, Going Postal. Worldview with love, The Nobodies. Action with worldview, The Parable of the Sower. A good way to innovate on your science fiction story is to try unexpected combinations of plot-driven and character-driven story types, or a combination that you find most personally evocative. And a quick recap before we move on to part 4. We've identified the 7 story types, and for each one, we've covered 5 essential story elements: the wants and needs, the basic motivation the protagonist of each story type must have, what's inherently at stake for the protagonist, that is, what they have to gain and what they risk losing as they go after what they want, the arc of change, that is, how the protagonist's state fundamentally changes from the beginning of the story to the end, the kind of emotions the reader of the story type hopes to feel, and the essential premise or message of the story type. Understanding these 5 elements helps you, the author, meet the expectations of your intended reader. Write a consistent story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and finish your story. Now, back to Anne.
Make sure I'm not on mute here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you, Rochelle. There is a subject that's near and dear to the hearts of so many science fiction writers, and that is world building. And we are running really long here, so I'm going to cover this real quickly and probably skip a few slides, just so everybody knows they will be in the slide deck for download later. We find that there are 3 main questions that any author of any story type needs to consider about the world in which their story is set, whether that's the most ordinary street in the most ordinary town in the present day, or on a planet orbiting a pair of binary stars at the edge of the galaxy. And those questions are: what obstacles and opportunities does the world present to the characters in your story? What is your narrative device and point of view? And how much does your reader need to know in order to keep reading? Under the broad category of obstacles and opportunities, we include all the things most of us think of as world building: climate and geography, socioeconomic system, culture, and the history that underlies the story's present, and the state of science and technology. Even if you're not writing science fiction, you probably want to reckon with those elements. So is life on a space station above a beautiful blue planet a good place to live, or is it a limiting environment that your protagonist wants to escape from? Conversely, a squalid dystopian slum might seem like a terrible obstacle, but it might also be an opportunity, because the most interesting and subversive people in your world all live there. You need to wonder if there's a class system in your future or alternative world, and if so, what's it based on? Can a character move up or move down or fall down? Do they want to? What about food? Fresh vegetables or pills and drinks? What are the constraints of communication? If your characters can communicate telepathically, how does that work? Does the speed of light create a significant barrier? Can just anyone send messages? How do they get around? Robot flying cars? In every instance, if your characters go places, important story constraints will include how they go, how much it costs in time and energy, and the obstacles and opportunities posed by the geography or the spaceography of your world. For example, a region full of pirates, a difficult planetary feature, an energy barrier in space, and so on. The point is, if a journey from point A to point B is smooth and uneventful, you probably don't need to describe it, and the landscape or the spacescape it covers probably isn't important to your story. Now, maybe you began with a world and a map, and that's great. By all means, flesh it out. Dozens of planets, hundreds of moons, give them all names, have a ball. Readers like maps, but your map is not your story. It's really only relevant to the degree to which it limits your characters' choices, raises the stakes, defines what they want and need, and supports your premise. After obstacles and opportunities, we ask, what is your narrative device and point of view? Which means, who's telling the story, to whom, why, and from what distance in space and time. For example, in The Martian, Mark Watney is keeping a log, partly to have a feeling of someone to talk to so he doesn't lose his mind, and partly to document his ordeal for posterity. His narrative is aimed primarily at his NASA teammates back home. For those reasons, he reveals a ton of information. He's an engineer and a scientist. He tells us about absolutely everything he does. And your narrative device is unlikely to be quite as obvious as The Martian's, but you need to have some idea of who your narrator is, why they're telling this story, to what audience, and from how far away in time. And that will constrain how much of your science fiction world you should describe, explain, or simply drop hints about. I'm going to skip a couple slides here. I don't want you to make the movie mistake. We all have seen most of the stories we absorb these days are by video, and filmmakers always add a ton of world building to every detail in every shot. As novelists, however, if we try to do that in words on the page, that's what I call the movie mistake. Let me give you an example. Here's a screenshot of a marketplace in Wakanda in Ryan Coogler's film Black Panther. Prince T'Challa, may he rest in peace, is out walking in Wakanda with his lady friend. It's hot. It's dusty. There's a smell of spices in the air. Handmade baskets hang in pegs from outside a shop. Plants grow up the sides of buildings everywhere. The architecture is a jumble of exuberant shapes and forms, colored patterns and black and white stripes. And the streetlights are hoops of vibranium. Buildings rise up a steep, lush green hill, taking advantage of every available space in this crowded, vibrant city. A streetcar with ovoid windows and copper trim makes its leisurely way along the narrow street, and brightly dressed people stroll out. Are you getting bored yet? Would you like me to get on with the story? Now, I don't know the answer. I don't know your reader. I don't know you. The point is, some readers like a good bit of description and scene setting in order to feel grounded in the story, and some have little patience for it at all. So the question is, what do you like? Write that. Test it with your beta readers. Be prepared to modify it based on feedback. No reader is ever going to picture the scene exactly as you do anyway. So all you can do is provide the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 details that drive the story forward while helping orient the reader and enter the spirit of the setting to form their own impressions. Now I'm going to skip a little group of slides here that we don't have time for, I'm sorry, but there are 3 pretty good guidelines here. First, less is usually more. If you show us a ship emerging from a wormhole in the region of a beautiful home planet, do we need to know very much about the wormhole itself? Maybe a little, maybe nothing. If you show us a shanty in a dystopian future favela on the edges of San Francisco, do we need to know how many windows it has? Probably not. Second, if the reader genuinely needs to understand an aspect of your world, prefer to give description over explanation and try not to interrupt action with either one of those things. And remember that dialogue is also action. And finally, select details that will pay off later. For example, if you're going to have the character's community wiped out by a meteor in the 3rd act, you probably need to introduce that meteor in the 1st act. Okay, we're almost there. This has been a lot to absorb. Let's quickly recap what we've covered. We've covered the 5 essential elements that every story needs. We've learned why the science fiction genre does not determine the kind of story that you're telling. We've learned the 7 story types and their importance for you as a science fiction writer, and how story type can help you meet all of your readers' expectations and help you innovate in the science fiction realm. And now you've got a little very quickly distilled philosophy of world building. And we hope that you are now ready to work on your science fiction story. Before we jump to the Q&A, just remember, we'd love to have you stop by pagesandplatforms.com/sci-fi for our free written guide to the 7 essential story types. And now for your questions.
Oh, thank you, Anna Rochelle, for that amazing session there. I'm going to pop my video on, but just for clarity, I might have to jump off if I freeze, just video-wise. But
we're really rushing there at the end.
Oh, no, we've had lots of questions. And one of them has just been, will we be able to get the slides after this session? And the answer to that is yes, they will be on the Sci-Fi Science Fiction Writers Week hub. That will be after this session as quickly as we can upload them and get the replay up as well, because I know that people have been frantically scribbling notes there. Yes, I'll jump into some of these questions. So I think you covered it mostly, but people have been asking sort of what if my story is all of these types, and are there too many types? If you feel like it falls into too many, is that a sign something's going wrong? Or yeah,
it is, and that's probably the most common question we receive. You do need to pick a primary one, and we've gone over how you pick that. It's the first thing to look at is what happens at the climax of your story. What's the big climactic event? How much does your character along what continuum does your character change the most? What is the biggest change they go through? Like the biggest possible one is alive to dead, usually. And then you look at that, how much, and that will help you figure out which is your primary story type. And yeah, everyone always, well, what if I want to tell all of those story types? Well, pick one, pick the secondary that goes with it, that drives it. So the sort of character-driven story that changes your action protagonist, for example. Anything else you have, kind of let it slip back in your mind and let it go.
There's always other stories you can tell.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing. We have a lot of clients who are like, you have 10 novels here. Could you just like, you have an opportunity to write 10 different books here.
Absolutely. So somebody asked a question I think relates quite well there. So what about protagonists who don't change their approach to the problem, i.e. Sherlock Holmes or James Bond? How do you?
Those are the yeah, those are the classic the examples. Superman's another one. Even James Bond has what we think of as a validation arc. He's always a little worried about, showing up right and attracting the most beautiful women. That's, success. So he's involved in that. So is Sherlock Holmes. When you think about how much he makes fun of the Victorian police and how much smarter he is than everybody, he doesn't change a lot, but he is very much internally motivated by honor and success and fame. What would I do without my blogger?
Maintaining his current position of success. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and does that kind of relate to, somebody asked about how you write sort of morally ambiguous characters or anti-heroes who perhaps have motivations that are a little bit confused, and that is part of their character. Would you say that they should really have an underlying
desire?
Yeah.
What are they going for? Right. They can be, you can absolutely have anti-heroes, morally ambiguous characters, but what do they want? What are they after? And that's going to help you define which story type you're in.
And in terms of ambiguity, not just what do they want, but just how far are they willing to go? An example, in Batman, he wants, let's get all the bad guys. He's very committed to justice, but he is not willing to kill anyone. No matter what, he's not willing to kill anyone. So he has his limits. So if you have this ambiguous character, you want to make sure they really want something bad and they have limits. There are certain things they won't do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Somebody asked if the validation story type is related to tragedy or the tragic flaw.
Can be.
Any of the internal character-driven story types can be tragic. So the idea is, do they choose to change or do they not choose to change? Do they choose to change for the better or do they choose to change for the worse, such as selling out or not
Breaking Bad?
Not great. Yeah, Breaking Bad, one of my absolute favorites. He gets redeemed a little bit in the end, but mostly he's just on a trip to hell. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. And you love him for it, but you hate him for it. And he does get redeemed in a little bit in the end, which gives us this feeling of satisfaction because we were attached to this criminal. We did want him to, at least in a certain extent, succeed, and we did want him to be redeemed. So there really was no other way to end that successfully. We needed a little bit of satisfaction because we were attached to him. But any of the stories can be tragic. Tragic just means that the protagonist didn't win in the end, that primarily they lost, only a small piece they won.
Absolutely. Somebody has asked if these types can be applied to fantasy as well as sci-fi, and if you
absolutely,
story, yeah, please, between two genres.
Yeah, we have a webinar on that too. It's somewhere we've done it for Pro Writing Aid before. I think it's still around somewhere. Yeah,
it's posted somewhere in the Fantasy Week from this last year. We did this whole workshop for fantasy. It's also in our story, in our Happily Ever After Club.
Cool. We'll see if we can dig that one up and put it out too.
I see that Kenyatta Williams said, would the war story be a type of action story or worldview? And that's an excellent question. If you go to RochelleRamirez.com, I have an entire blog post, very lengthy one, on the war story. The war story is, I hate war. I love the war story because it's usually primarily action, but not always. It can be crime if the problem is war crimes. Yes, there's usually a worldview shift, but primarily what we tend to see in traditional war stories are this success, honor, brotherhood stories, and that tends to fall more in the validation story. So you really want to know what is the primary thing you're hanging your protagonists' want and need are. Are they trying to avoid the truth, or trying to get to the truth, or meaning, or something? That's worldview. If they are trying, if their main thing is this brotherhood, honor, we want to win because, you know, we want to validate our country or our team, or that's validation. And you can mix those two. You can mix them a little bit, but you do want to know one or the other, what's your primary story you're telling.
And someone in the comments is mentioning that there's sort of a found family aspect or
Yep.
love, brotherhood, love element to war stories. Very often there's a strong love of that type, not romance necessarily, unless it's Song of Achilles,
Right.
but yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But that brotherhood piece is I don't know what else to say other than brotherhood. I'm sure there's a better word. Connection, intimacy. I don't know.
Comradeship, brothers in arms, all that,
is often quite integral to that story.
Yeah.
And depending on how, there are some beautiful stories that the war is the backdrop of the story. The war is just the setting of maybe a beautiful love story.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can find there's often quite a lot of joy in those stories,
Right.
and it's made all the more poignant by that backdrop of war. And I think that can be so effective. Yeah, I mean, somebody asked if you can have multiple themes in a story, and I think that kind of answers that as well, that you can have kind of multiple themes, multiple story types. It's just controlling those and knowing how they all work together and bring out different nuances in
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Somebody asked why you consider or why you call love a plot story instead of a character story.
It's both.
It's both.
It kind of has a foot in both, on both sides of the equation.
Because the issue being other is external, gaining the love of the other person, and this, what you have to the lover is the antagonistic force in the story, because it's the other lover who's forcing the protagonist to change. So there's an external force forcing the change of an internal changes that must be made in order to be worthy of love. So it's you know, there's no usual there. You can have usually validation or worldview is the internal shift. Most often, probably.
But it's got a foot in each camp, and I think that's probably the most important thing we can say about it. There's a question here I want to hit before we go. What do you consider the line between science fiction and fantasy? We did research. There's not a hard line as far as I can tell. We know we strayed across it in several instances. Generally, science fiction has science, technology, you know, but it can be really weird science and border into fantasy. So yeah, I don't have a solid answer for that. We grappled with that quite a bit while we were developing this and picking our examples.
And last thing, I'll be over on the Facebook page answering questions in and out throughout the day. So visit me over there, Pro Writing Aid Facebook page, and I'll answer the questions.
That should probably be the Circle community. So you'll have a link, hopefully everybody here will have a link in their email to our, or on the hub as well, to Circle, which is our brand new way of connecting with everyone. So we'll make sure that Anne and Rochelle have access to that. So you should be able to ask your questions over in the Science Fiction Writers Week space there. We are pretty much out of time.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, I mean, oh God, so many questions, because I think it's just such a compelling subject and helps you see your story in a brand new way. I am dropping a bunch of links in chat, and I've been keeping an eye on things that people have been asking for in the chat as well, and I'll make sure that we get some links to Rochelle's blog and everything up as well on the hub. If in doubt, check the hub. That's where the replay and the download for the slides will be. And I suppose all that's left to say is thank you, Anna Rochelle, so much for
thank you.
Thank you,
we love doing
everyone.
This. We love
it's
doing
been great.
We love having
love
you.
to come back.
And we hope that everyone can join us for our next session on creating emotionally impactful science fiction, which is happening in just under an hour. So we will see you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thanks. Bye-bye.